I would like to now talk about the bones of the spinal column. The spinal column consists of a cervical region, your neck, a thoracic region, your chest, a lumbar region, your low back, one sacrum, and one coccyx. The spinal column gives support and yet allows movement of your torso, and in addition, holds up your head. This is a model of the spinal column, and you can see that the sacrum is attached to your os coxa, or your hip bones, which are part of your lower appendage. We have cervical vertebra. In fact, we have 7 cervical vertebrae. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, if I've counted correctly, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That brings us to the sacrum, which brings us to the coccyx. The coccyx is the remnant of your tailbone. We had said that one of the things that the spinal column does is to hold up your head, and the articulation is with the occipital bone. We can see the foramen magnum right there, and on either side of the foramen magnum are occipital condyles, which articulate with the first cervical vertebra. This is the first cervical vertebra. It is called Atlas. It's called Atlas because it's holding up your world. Your world is your brain. Now, all vertebrae are pretty much the same, except for the first 2 cervical vertebrae. Let me show you a typical cervical vertebra. This would be the superior surface, and this would be the inferior surface. Now, it has, like all vertebra, a body. It has transverse processes. It has a lamina on either side, which goes to a spinous process, lamina to the spinous process. Now, a typical cervical vertebra has 2 points on its spinous process. So that means that this is a bifid spinous process, and that makes it a typical cervical vertebra. It has a hole in it, and that hole is for the spinal cord. So that hole is called the vertebral foramen. Every vertebrae has one. In addition, we see two other foramen, and only in the cervical region are we going to see these. These are the transverse foramen, and they are going to hold blood vessels that go to your brain. Right here, see if I can bring this in a little bit closer. Right here and right here is where the posterior aspect attaches to the body. These are called the pedicles. These are called the pedicles. Let's go back to our first two cervical vertebrae. Which articulate together. The second cervical vertebra does have a body, but that body has an extension, and that extension is called the dens or the odentoid process. The first cervical vertebrae is missing that. There is no body. The body of the first cervical vertebra has ended up articulating, attached firmly to the body of the second cervical vertebra. Now, that's unique among vertebrae. That allows for a great deal of rotation. And in the cervical region, you should have approximately 180 degrees of cervical rotation. Fully 90 of those degrees, 90 of the 180, come from the articulation of the first two cervical vertebrae. Now, I can call this one C1 and this one C2, but I can also call this one atlas and this one axis because it has the pivot around which C1 or atlas pivots the dens. Thoracic vertebrae have a body, have a vertebral foramen, have a spinous process, but now look at the shape of the spinous process. It's elongated and it is in the oblique plane. It is neither vertical or horizontal. And this is unique to the thoracic area. We also see lamina. What's noticeable on this vertebra, which wasn't noticeable on other vertebra, was projections here and here. And these are smooth portions. You can see how smooth they are. These are the articular facets. Articular facets allow one vertebrae to articulate with another vertebrae. So these would be the superior articular facets, and these would be the inferior articular facets. The bodies carry the weight. The articular facets guide the motion. So depending on which plane they're in, there's different motions. We had said, for the most part, there is rotation in the cervicals. That's because the facets are like this. In the thoracic region, the facets are more like this kind of motion. This is a lumbar vertebrae. You can see that there is a very, very big body, a short, very thick, very strong spinous process. There are also transverse processes, again, very short, very thick, superior articular facets, and inferior articular facets. And this allows for motion in the lumbar region, okay, that is a lot of rotation again, and yet allows for some forward, limited backward flexion. Forward, limited backward flexion. So there are a lot of clues to which vertebrae we're looking at. Lumbar vertebrae, nice big body, and in fact, the body is somewhat kidney shaped, and at least part of the kidney is right about there, lumbar region. The thoracic vertebrae smaller bodies, heart-shaped, and that's where your heart is, in your thoracic region. And the spinous process is extended, elongated, and in the oblique plane. Typical cervical vertebrae, very small body. And it is the only place where we see these holes in the transverse processes. Okay, you can see the holes there. So that gives you a clue as to its being a cervical vertebrae. And then we have the atypical vertebrae. We have the second cervical vertebrae axis with the body of the first cervical vertebra attached. This is called the odontoid process, or the dens. And then we have the first cervical vertebrae, no body. Still it has foramen, in the transverse process. Next, we have the sacrum. And the sacrum is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fused vertebra into one solid piece, and attached to that is the coccyx, 1, 2, 3, 4 fused vertebra, and this is your tailbone, or what's left of it. We have the sacral promontory, which would normally be the body of a vertebra. We have the sacral facets. We have the sacral foramen, through which sacral nerves can travel. We no longer have a spinous process. We have the median sacral crest. We no longer have transverse processes. We have the lateral sacral crest. And we have the articulations for the sacrum with the hip bone, or the os coxa. Attached to the thoracic vertebra, we have the ribs. We have 12 pair of ribs. In other words, 12 on either side. We can give these ribs names: first rib, second rib, third rib, fourth rib, and so forth, on down to the 12th rib. We can classify these ribs as to how they attach to the sternum. The first 7 ribs have their own costal cartilage, and so they are called true ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ribs 8, 9, ribs 8, 9, and 10 have their costal cartilage attached to the 7th costal cartilage. So the first 7 are called true ribs, and 8, 9, and 10 are called false ribs, and 11 and 12 do not have any costal cartilage at all, so they are floating ribs. They are floating ribs. So here is the first rib. It is very small by comparison to another rib. This would be the head. This would be the tubercle. This would be the angle. The flattened surface is what attaches to the costal cartilage. So that is the costal surface. The head attaches to the vertebrae in the posterior, and difficult to see in this picture. Let me grab thoracic vertebrae. So we have a thoracic vertebrae, okay, and we have a rib that is going to articulate like that with the thoracic vertebrae. The head of the rib is going to articulate with two different bodies, the superior and inferior body, and then the tubercle is going to articulate with the thoracic transverse process. And then we have the squared off end, which is going to articulate with the costal cartilage. This is a floating rib. I can tell that because the end that does not articulate with the bodies of the thoracic vertebrae is rounded. In addition, it's very, very small by comparison to other ribs. And very, very little angle and not much of a tubercle. This is the sternum, to which the ribs attach via costal cartilages. Now, it is composed of three bones: the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. Right here, I can feel a notch. That's this notch here, and that's the jugular notch. Where the manubrium attaches to the body, there's a bit of a bump. That is the angle of Louis. That is the angle of Louis. Finally, I want to show you the hyoid bone. It's a simple U-shaped bone, and it's right up here in my neck. And it is an anchor for the tongue, and it has a couple of points called horns. The small ones are the lesser horns. The larger ones are the greater horns. This concludes our talk on the axial skeleton. We'll continue with the appendicular skeleton